Moreover, I think there's some lessons learned from global economic reform. Opening up of markets to trade by lifting tariffs and other barriers have greatly benefited the world's fastest growing economies of China, India, and Vietnam. China's economic modernization has lifted almost 400 million citizens out of poverty since 1990, the most spectacular reduction of poverty in world history over the past 25 years. Nevertheless, concomitant with this development has been rising income inequality within China. Some 450 million Chinese still live on less than $2 a day. In this sense, China is the first poor global economic superpower in history. China and India together constitute 40% of the world's population. As long as they remain poor, in some sense, the world will remain poor also. Finally, how can Westmont play a role in educating global citizens about the challenges of natural resource consumption? Countries such as India and China, we are all increasingly aware, have massive populations with correspondingly massive needs for resources. We're seeing this not merely in the rising price of oil, but also in copper, aluminum, and other commodity and metal prices. By the way, it's no surprise the number of thefts of aluminum metal siding, of bolts, have dramatically increased with those rising commodity prices. The U.S. and other nations need to find ways of stemming environmental decay, as rapid industrialization has already caused a sharp increase in air pollution. China, for example, has 16 of the world's 20 most air-polluted cities. How does the global imperative apply here? At Westmont, then, we raise these questions, and I think we want to provide a liberal arts education that will challenge our students to continually improve in their thinking abilities on these and a score of other questions, to engage in trenchant critique of easy answers, and to appreciate the complexity of global issues. Our imperative is to challenge our students to be lifelong learners in a global context, whether they enter the business world, the world of government policy, the nonprofit sector. But I think most importantly, how do we acquire not merely global knowledge, but global wisdom? The wisdom that addresses discerning followers of Christ to take the gospel to every tribe, tongue, and nation. Thanks.
Well, I'd like to start by thanking my colleagues for what they have shared. I would just like to add a few comments, and I will seek to be brief so we can have some time to hear from you, about the role of history in training people for the global imperative. It seems to me that asking a fusty historian such as myself to speak about the global imperative in the 21st century is a bit like asking somebody from People magazine to speak about discretion. Certainly, I imagine if you interviewed 18-year-olds intent on making their way in the world in the 21st century, which subject they were most interested in taking, history would not rank way up there on their list. But I am very committed to the idea that the teaching of history is absolutely vital to preparing people for service in our world. And I think that's what a Christian college should be about at the end of the day. We are not here for ourselves. Christ does not call us to look after ourselves. He calls us to serve others, as my colleagues have so eloquently expressed. And so I've personally been very encouraged by the emphasis on the global mandate that we as Christians have that Dr. Beebe has brought with him since last July. So why history? Well, let me start with some unsolicited dating advice that I give to my world history students on the first day of class. The first question I ask them to consider in the class is, if you were on your third date with a person, so this was starting to get fairly serious, and it was evident that there's some mutual attraction going on, and you're beginning to wonder, is this the sort of person I want to have a longer-term relationship with? What sort of questions would you want them to ask you? It gets all sorts of interesting responses. But basically what comes across is, I want the man, I want the woman to ask me questions about who I really am, about where I come from. Students acknowledge that if you start to talk about your grandparents on a third date and the person across the table from you says, "Can we talk about something else? I'm not really interested in that," that's a bad sign. We intuitively know that if we are to love somebody, we have to understand where they've come from. That is something which is basic to our understanding of human relationships. That's why we need to study history. That's why we need to know where the world has come from. Because without that knowledge, it's going to be impossible for us to love the world. If we want to understand people from other places, we need to know where they've come from if we are to understand who they are in the present. And a large part of that, of course, is their history. So for me, history is ultimately about loving people from all sorts of different places, because that is what helps us to understand who they are, how they came to be the people that they are. History also makes you a curious person. Curious in the sense of inquisitive. It may make you curious in other ways as well, but let's focus on being inquisitive for a moment. History introduces you to a remarkable range of remarkable people who are typically remarkably different from you or me. One of the great things about teaching history is you get to bring in all sorts of wonderful stories which express the interest and the humor and the wonders of human experience. Everything from French peasant women mooning a representative of the supreme being who was being imposed on their village, to English families, working class families in the 19th century who gave Godfrey's cordial and opiate to their children because the reigning medical wisdom was that babies should be still at all times. Indian parents who gave their children the names of Japanese admirals after the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 because they were so thrilled that for the first time in a long time an Asian power had beat a European power. And the British national anthem being used at the coronation of the first king of Iraq. History is filled with all sorts of things like this. And as we learn these stories, as we encounter these people, we find that we're stretched to engage and enjoy things and people who are very different from ourselves. And that, of course, is what global interaction demands. Now, we're not going to fully understand other people, and I warn the male students in my classes that premature balding may be one of the results of careful engagement with the world due to the amount of head scratching that it's going to require. But that's another thing which history gives us. It gives us humility. It helps us to know that my way is not the only way. Of course, that is what we all grow up thinking, more or less. And part of education is realizing that that is not true. And so as we seek to teach our students to be willing to learn from others, to be patient before they jump in with both feet and judge others, understanding history, understanding the different cultures from which people come is absolutely vital. So as we think about the global imperative, it seems to me that human interaction is at the heart of that. And if we are to interact well with others, we need to understand them, and we need to have the curiosity and the humility to work with them and to care with them. As I close, I want to return to the date analogy and the fundamental point that in order to love somebody, we need to understand them. And for me, that is the ultimate global imperative for us as Christians. Jesus sends us into the world to do what he did, to love others, whether that is teaching them the truth about the Father or ministering to their physical and other needs. History and the social sciences more broadly prepare us to do that. And that's why it's so good that at a place like Westmont, the social sciences find a very good home at the heart of our curriculum.